Good morning, everybody. In my presentation today, I would like to speak about the precautionary principle in connection to climate law and also about scientific uncertainty, because scientific uncertainty makes an important element of the precautionary principle. So my objective is to focus on how climate science views the scientific uncertainty. I will divide my presentation into three parts. In the first part, I will speak in general about the precautionary principle. I will ask what it means, what elements does it have, and also how it relates to climate change. Second, I will ask why climate lawyers and policymakers need so much climate science. And thirdly, I will deal the uncertainty as such, and I will try to explain how climate scientists describe the uncertainty in their own field. So let's get started. Firstly, the principle of precaution is often placed alongside the principle of prevention, but there are differences between them. First, the prevention principle is much older, but the precaution appeared some around 1980s. But a bigger difference is about what risks these principles are about. So the principle of prevention deals with known or foreseeable risks and tries to protect the environment against these known and foreseeable risks. Also, the principle of precaution guides us in dealing with unknown or unforeseeable risks. There are several understandings of precautionary principle. Some authors even claim that we should, in fact, speak about principles of precaution in plural. And now I will explain to you, I would say, strongest understandings of the precautionary principle that appear in literature. So the first one is that tries to protect the environment, just to not permit activities that would be harmful to the environment. It means that this understanding of the precautionary principle prescribes in any decision-making to base the decision upon the worst option that appears among several options that may occur, and to base the decision on the most adverse one. It means that in this sense, the precaution has really a high level of protection for the environment. It's also logical that this understanding of precaution is used mostly in areas, or should be used mostly in areas where new technologies are used, like genetically modified organisms or geoengineering, because these technologies are so recent that the people do not know exact long-term consequences of using these technologies. The second understanding of the precautionary principle is more, I would like to say, positive, because it supports a positive action to protect the environment, even when there is a situation that there is some risk which is not known, and we even do not know if the harm really occurs or not. So we cannot exclude the harm occurrence, but still we should proactively act to protect the environment. And this understanding of the precautionary principle is used in the international climate change regime. You can see that the formulation of the precautionary principle is embedded in Article 3, Paragraph 3 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures, taking into account that policies and measures to deal with climate change should be cost-effective, so as to ensure global benefits at the lowest possible cost. Here we also can see the main elements of the precautionary principle. I would say that first two of them are connected with the situation when we decide whether apply or not apply the principle of precaution, so the damage and lack of full scientific certainty. And the third one, the cost effectiveness, would apply later when we just prepare the measures that are reply to the precautionary principle. On the contrary, the Paris Agreement does not explicitly mention the precautionary principle, but the Framework Convention covers the whole, with principles, I mean, the whole area of the international climate change law. So it's not a problem that Paris Agreement doesn't mention the principle explicitly. Now I would like to explain more the elements of the precautionary principle as we saw them in the formulation of the Framework Convention. So the first one, scientific uncertainty. We know that scientific uncertainty is really present throughout the whole climate science, throughout all the reports of the panel on climate change. And it's something that develops on the other hand, because we can see that with development of the climate science, the level of uncertainty decreases. For example, if some issue was very uncertain some 15 or 10 years ago, at the moment it is likely that the same issue would be assessed with a higher level of certainty by climate scientists. And I will speak about the scientific uncertainty later. Next, the severity of harm. So the formulation of the Framework Convention requires, in order to apply the principle of precaution, that the harm that we expect to occur has to be either irreversible or serious. So here we have two concepts that have to be interpreted. I think that the irreversibility of the harm can be maybe easier to interpret. We have, for example, the clue that are the tipping points, so-called tipping points, are the points when we step over these points in our activities. It would mean, according to climate scientists, that the state of the environment cannot or no more be returned back to the previous stability. On the other hand, the serious harm, it's a term more complicated to explain. So when the harm is serious and when it is not so serious. Still, we have some clues again. We can, for example, take the text of the Paris Agreement that speaks about that we should not allow exceeding the global temperature in more than 2 degrees of Celsius, because if the global temperature rises more than 2 degrees Celsius, then it means that a really serious harm would occur to human society and the environment. So we can take this as some measurement or threshold for measuring serious harm, even when we apply the precautionary principle. The third, cost effectiveness, I think it's the most complicated one of them are for lawyers, because it is an economic category. And when we see the formulation I showed a while ago about cost effectiveness, it's not clear enough, or it is clear only at first sight. For example, we don't know if any and every measure that is prepared against climate change should, for example, undergo a cost-benefit analysis. However, we have some general rules that are feasible also for other branches, not only for economists. For example, the rule that the costs of prevention are almost always lower than the costs needed for redress, I mean, for restoration of the environment and for compensations for damages to people and things and so on. And now why we should connect the precautionary principle with climate change. I think there are several arguments in favor why to apply the principle in climate change problem. First, the climate change is a very complex problem that rises in time more and more because the greenhouse gases, when once emitted into the atmosphere, they accumulate there and new emissions are added to the atmosphere, so the problem is bigger and more serious through the time. And the gases have long-lasting negative effects, so the problem rises all the time. Moreover, there is a risk of really serious or even catastrophic consequences of the presence of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I have already spoken about the tipping points and irreversible harms. So these two arguments really speak in favor of applying the principle to the problem of climate change. Also, the principle has been originally used in environmental law. This is one of its cornerstones. On the other hand, there are also some arguments against the precautionary principle. The first one, and the strongest one, of course, is about money, because the measures that correspond to precaution can be very costly. And we can hear these arguments, especially from representatives of industries, of fossil fuel industries, because these are the industries that would or will be probably the most seriously affected by climate measures. So they claim that the climate science is so uncertain that it cannot justify such painful and costly measures. Moreover, there is a possible comparison with one historic example when the precautionary principle was used, and it was the ozone layer depletion problem. This problem was often cited as a successful example of how the precautionary principle was used, because in this problem, the international community succeeded in preparing and agreeing effective, quick and strong measures. So the problem was really solved. In contrast, I would say climate change is often described as even more serious problem. But here, the precautionary principle seems to not be applied enough. So some authors even say that the humankind might have somehow missed the right moment to use the precautionary measures, and now it may be even too late to still apply precaution, and we may need only to solve the consequences that have already occurred. They even speak about a post-cautionary world. And now, what about the climate science? So climate science and its findings are really key for climate law and policy, for policy making. The main source of scientific knowledge in the field of climate science is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is a body that was created earlier than the international climate change regime. And it is a body composed of independent scientists from all the world. And the body has not a status of an international organization. It is also interesting that the panel is not explicitly related or referenced in climate agreements. So there are no special linking. For example, the agreements do not prescribe that the states must adhere to the panel's recommendations, but nevertheless, the panel has such a high level of authority that naturally its recommendations are usually taken seriously, and the documents of the panel are usually taken as a basis upon which the climate agreements are agreed. The fact that the panel is not an international organization and that there are no interlinkages with climate agreements also mean that the outcomes of the panel are not binding for states or any other subjects. The main role of the panel is not to conduct a basic research, but to collect, evaluate, and overview or summarize the existing knowledge, scientific knowledge in the field of climate change. So it issues regularly its assessment reports. And recently, the 6th assessment report, or its first part, has been published. As I already mentioned, the climate science is full of uncertainties, and it is present even throughout the assessment reports. When we open the report anywhere, we can see many expressions of this uncertainty. And during the time, the panel developed something like uncertainty language. It means that they tried to guide the authors, the climate scientists, to use certain expressions uniformly, just to unify the way how these expressions are used to communicate the level of uncertainty better, not only among the climate scientists, but also to other fields of study, just to understand each other. Here it is an excerpt from the summary for policymakers, and you can see several examples of this uncertainty language. For example, something is virtually certain, something is extremely likely, or there is a high confidence about something, or medium confidence about something. So let's have a look at how to explain this uncertainty language. Above all, there is not only one scale of this uncertainty language. So we don't have only one series of some values, but there are in fact 3 parallel scales that take into account different aspects of the matter. So the first one is the evidence agreement scale that in fact has 2 parts, evidence and agreement. So these are 2 subscales that are used together to describe something. Evidence describes how much, so what amount of evidence is available about some issue. And the agreement describes the level of agreement on this issue among climate scientists. So when we describe some issue, we need to combine both. So we, for example, may say that something has a limited evidence and low agreement. The confidence scale is closely connected to the evidence agreement scale because it should serve as a translation of the 2 evidence agreement into one word. However, it doesn't work 100% because when you take some combinations, it's not easy to just transform them into the confidence scale. For example, when I take limited evidence and low agreement, I can say it is a low confidence. It's clear, but some other combinations are not so clear. So even the climate scientists criticize and doubt this confidence scale, and they ask why at all we should have this scale. But never mind, I don't know why they still have this even in the 6th report. The third one is the likelihood scale. And this is one that can be somehow quantified. You can see that there are 10 levels of likelihood, and to all of them, I have not every example here, but to all of them some numbers count in percentages. So when it is possible to express something in quantity, in percentage, then it is good to use this likelihood scale. Again, there are some doubts among the climate scientists how to differentiate between likelihood and confidence. Probably we can say that if it is possible to quantify, then it's possible to use likelihood scale, and when only qualitative assessment is possible, then we use confidence. But as you can see, even the climate scientists have some doubts and questions and unclear. They just criticize this uncertainty language, how it has developed. So I think all the more we lawyers cannot fully understand how these scales together work and how they can be used. Nevertheless, I think that for our precautionary principle, these scales should serve as some basis. Of course, it's complicated for lawyers, but in the sources I have studied, I have not come across any direct relations how this uncertainty language relates to practical application of the principle of precaution. But I think we could guess, or we could consider that if something is, for example, assessed as virtually certain, then I would say we are in the field of principle of prevention, because the risk is known, so it's clear. But when it comes to some other values, for example, likely, very likely, or very unlikely, but still we cannot exclude the risk, then we should take the principle of precaution and apply it to the situation. And when I come to the bottom, exceptionally unlikely, I would say we can almost exclude the risk. Maybe 0 to 1% is very low risk of something. So again, we are out of the principle of precaution maybe. So I would assess it this way. And now I'm coming to summary and some conclusions. I was speaking about the principle of precaution that has some preconditions to be applied. It is a condition of the harm or risk and of a scientific uncertainty. And I was linking the principle to climate change. I think the complex problem of climate change is a good example where the principle should be really used. Then I was speaking about climate science that is full of uncertainties, and about the uncertainty language, which is not easy to understand even to climate scientists. Nevertheless, I think that climate science as a whole gives us enough evidence that the climate crisis is really serious and that we need to apply precautionary measures to avert the catastrophe. And with this, I would finish my presentation and thank you for your attention.